My mom used to tell me stories about my grandpa when I was a child, about how he began with nothing and created a business that might have provided for us forever. However, we never saw any of it. It wasn't until I was older and could comprehend the chaos around his will that I truly understood why. My mom once stated, "Eliza, your grandpa was a tough nut on a cold night." We were drinking mugs of lukewarm tea while seated at our tiny kitchen table. The landlord took a while to fix the heater once it broke again. He simply thought that money should be earned rather than given. Then why did he interrupt us? He expected you to handle his finances, didn't he? I asked, attempting to avoid seeming resentful. With a sigh, Mom traced the steam rising from her cup with her eyes. I wasn't supposed to handle it. He came up with a wild notion of writing a will that would only distribute his riches to someone who achieved success on their own. In their business, at least $500,000. I whispered, "That's just cruel." A gain created by a man who valued money over his family sounded like a ridiculous notion. Mom went on, "It was his way or the highway. He essentially disowned me when I disagreed with him. Said that I could earn my way without his assistance if I was good." I kept thinking about how unjust everything was. While someone else was enjoying what should have been ours, we were scrounging and conserving every penny. I've always had a talent for seeing an opportunity to profit. On hot summer days, I would set up a lemonade shop at the nearby golf course. 50 cents a cup. I would shout and wave to the golfers who were thirsty. The pitch from a freckled child with a pitcher was too strong for them to ignore. "You sure know how to hustle, kiddo," said Hank, an elderly golfer, laughing as he gave me my change. "Keep that up, and you'll be a tycoon one day." I smiled and put the money in my pocket. I would reply, "Just saving up for something big," because I was constantly thinking about the next big thing. It wasn't just lemonade either. Using beads I found at the dollar shop, I strung together handmade bracelets and baubles. Everywhere I could, including at school functions, neighborhood block parties, and even in the front yard during garage sales, I sold them. Trading seemed natural, like if I was destined to do it, and it was more than simply enjoyable. My mom used to joke to her friends, "Eliza's got her own little business empire going," but there was a tinge of pride in her voice that gave me a slight boost in confidence. However, what truly stood out was the stitching. It felt like all of my Christmases had arrived at once when I was able to purchase that vintage sewing machine at a yard sale. It was difficult for me to learn how to sew. The online instructions weren't always clear, and the machine was erratic, particularly when the internet connection was intermittent. However, I persisted. Before long, I was transforming plain clothes from the thrift shop into stylish ensembles. "Eliza, is that the same shirt you wore last week?" One day, Sarah spotted me at my locker and scoffed. "Looks different." "Yes, gave it a little makeover," I remarked nonchalantly as I closed my locker. "You need to give it a go sometime. It might help you feel better." A few other females stayed behind, but she sneered and marched off. "What you did with your shirt was absolutely awesome." With a bashful grin on her lips, one of them said, "Could you do mine?" Of course. With pride in my heart, I said, "Bring it tomorrow." After word spread, I started accepting bespoke orders. It was no longer simply pocket money. It was serious business. People were willing to pay a high price for originality, which I was all too glad to supply. I carried my most recent masterpieces to the neighborhood street festival one lovely day. My pulse racing with the excitement of it all, I put out my clothes, set up a rickety table, and waited. "You think people will buy these?" My friend Mike looked at the onlookers doubtfully and questioned. "They'd be crazy not to," I said with a growing sense of certainty. And they did. They crowded my table. I hardly had time to pick up the cash and deliver the clothing. A man with his car keys jangling in his palm came up among the confusion. "Hey, a block away from here, my car broke down. I saw your booth. This stuff is yours," he said, gesturing to my improvised exhibit. Yes, everything was produced by myself. "While you wait for a towel, do you need anything to do?" I gave him a shirt and joked. He chuckled, a real laugh that made his head pop back. "Actually, I was wondering if you'd do men's stuff too," he said. "Sure do," I said, taking out a couple of the bits I had tried. After glancing over them, he gave me a curious glance. "You're talented. Have you considered turning this into a legitimate business?" "Every day," I said without a pause. His grin got bigger. "I'm Jack, by the way." "Elisa," I replied, sensing the gravity of the situation as I shook his hand. This seemed like a portal swinging wide open. It wasn't simply another transaction. I tallied the money as the day came to an end, feeling a wave of satisfaction. One stitch at a time, I was making it happen. This was it. Mike replied, "Told you they'd love your stuff," while assisting me with packing. "Yes, you were right," I said, my smile uncontrollable. "Looks like I might just make that $500,000 mark after all." Things started off more quickly than I had anticipated when Jack and I met at the fair. He was different from the men I knew. He was from a wealthy family, but when you were with him, you forgot about it. He seemed carefree. He was always making plans and smiling. We began spending more time together, and soon we were in a committed relationship. He once said, "Elisa, I think it's time you met my parents." Just thinking about it made my stomach turn. I was aware that his parents were old money, the sort that denigrated others like me. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice tense. "I don't think they'll like me much." Jack laughed it off. "They'll love you. Don't worry so much." The drive over to Jack's parents' house felt like the longest ride of my life. Jack kept talking about mundane stuff, probably trying to ease the tension, but my stomach was in knots. We turned into a long driveway, and there it was, a massive house that looked more like a museum than a home. We walked up to the grand entrance, and the door swung open before we could even knock. There stood Jack's mom, Mrs. Thompson, dressed impeccably in a way that made me feel underdressed instantly, despite my careful choice of outfit. "Jack, darling," she exclaimed, pulling him into a hug, then turned to me with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "And you must be Elisa. We've heard so much about you." Her words sounded warm, but her tone was anything but. I forced a smile. "Thank you for having me, Mrs. Thompson." Jack led me inside, and that's when Mr. Thompson appeared. He was a tall, stern-looking man with a firm handshake that felt more like a test than a greeting. "Elisa, a pleasure," he said, his voice deep and unemotional. We moved into the living room, which was as grand and cold as the rest of the house. Everything felt stiff and formal. We made small talk, or at least they did. I mostly nodded and smiled, feeling out of my depth. Dinner was served in a dining room straight out of a magazine, with crystal and fine china that looked like it should be locked up in a display case, not used for eating. We sat down, and that's when the real interrogation began. "So, Elisa, Jack tells us you're into fashion design." Mr. Thompson began, eyeing me like I was a problem he needed to figure out. "Yes, I run a small business. I design and sell clothing," I responded, trying to keep my voice steady. Self-made then." "How entrepreneurial," he commented dryly, his tone suggesting it was less of a compliment and more a checkmark on a list of curiosities. Mrs. Thompson chimed in with a smile that felt more like a sneer. "And your family, dear? What do they do?" "Well, it's just me and my mom." "She's a nurse," I said, feeling the weight of each word. "Oh, I see," Mrs. Thompson replied, exchanging a glance with her husband that I couldn't quite read. The conversation stumbled along until coffee was served. Then Mrs. Thompson's polite mask slipped. "Elisa, I must be honest. We have certain hopes for Jack, and his partner's background is important to us. It's essential for maintaining the family's reputation and legacy." Finally, she put her fork down and said flatly, "Well, it's clear you've done quite a bit despite your background, but I don't think you're suitable for our son." I'm afraid her words hit like a slap. I sat there stunned as she got up from the table. "I won't waste more time here," she declared and left the room without another word. Jack was quick to comfort me, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Elisa, please don't take it to heart. She said in her ways." It was tough to swallow. The evening had turned into a stark display of where I stood with his family. Despite Jack's reassurances, the shadow of that dinner lingered, casting a cold shadow over what should have been a happy milestone. The engagement happened despite the frosty atmosphere at dinner that night at Jack's parents' house. His folks made it clear they weren't thrilled, but Jack went ahead with the proposal. We were officially engaged, and while I was over the moon about us, the chill from his parents was something I couldn't shake off. A few weeks after our engagement, I got a call from Mrs. Thompson, Jack's mom. Her voice was formal. "Elisa, I'd like you to come over. We need to discuss something important." When I arrived, both of Jack's parents were waiting. The house felt colder than ever, like all the warmth had been sucked out of it. Mrs. Thompson didn't waste any time. "Elisa, we've looked into your background thoroughly," she began, her tone sharp and unwelcoming. Mr. Thompson nodded, his face stern. "It's clear you come from a very different world than ours," his wife continued. "And frankly, we feel you're hunting for wealth, climbing through our son. But we won't allow our family fortune to be jeopardized." The words stung, but before I could react, Mrs. Thompson slid a stack of papers across the table towards me. "Since I can't convince Jack to rethink this marriage, you'll need to sign these," she said flatly. I picked up the papers. They were a prenuptial agreement. As I read through it, it was clear I wouldn't lay claim to any of Jack's wealth, and neither would any children we might have. Without hesitating, I signed them. "I'm not marrying Jack for his money," I said, handing the signed papers back to her. Mrs. Thompson looked taken aback, her eyes wide. Even Mr. Thompson raised an eyebrow, surprised by my quick compliance. I left their house feeling a mix of relief and resentment. At home, I told Jack everything. He laughed it off. "Wow, you really showed them. Good for you." But his laughter didn't sit right with me. "Aren't you bothered that your mom thinks so lowly of me? She humiliated me," I said. He shrugged, still smiling. "I get why you're upset, but you know how Mom is. She has her reasons, and well, she's not completely wrong to worry, right?" His words felt like a slap. Not only had his mother insulted me, but now Jack was subtly defending her. It hurt realizing that maybe he wasn't entirely in my corner. A year after our engagement, as the wedding drew closer, my life was a whirlwind of excitement and stress. My business, a sportswear brand I had started from scratch, was finally taking off. It was thrilling to see my designs being worn and loved. I had built a small capital, enough to expand and take on bigger challenges. As for the wedding, I wanted something simple and intimate, but Jack had other ideas. He dreamed of a lavish celebration. "Elisa, we're only doing this once. Let's make it big," he'd say with that grin that made it hard to argue. So I agreed, and we planned a grand event. I found myself splitting the bill for a grand venue, exquisite catering, and a band that could keep our guests dancing all night. I managed to snag some deals, haggling discounts wherever I could. Old habits die hard. The wedding day was perfect, at least on the surface. Our guests seemed to have the time of their lives, and I couldn't stop smiling. We were floating, caught up in a bubble of joy. But not everyone was caught up in the festivity. Throughout the evening, I caught Jack's parents whispering, their faces pinched with disapproval. His mother, ever the social butterfly, floated around the room, dropping hints about her worries that I was after their family wealth. I overheard her telling a group of relatives, "It's all very extravagant, isn't it?" I just hope she understands the value of money, not just spending it. Her voice was loud enough to carry, and her words stung more than I expected. After the wedding, things didn't settle down. Jack's mom posted on social media, lamenting that Jack had married someone like me. She wrote about her fear of losing her son to a woman who, in her eyes, wasn't worthy. Reading those words hurt. I felt my throat tighten and my eyes burn, not just with sadness, but with frustration. I tried to talk to Jack about it. Your mom's posts, they're really harsh. Can you talk to them? They don't even know about the business, how well it's doing. Jack sighed, his face troubled. Elisa, I know it's tough, but let's not rock the boat, okay? My parents, it's just how they are. But they think I'm some gold digger, Jack. They don't see that I don't need their money. He pulled me close, his voice soothing. I know, but let's just ignore it for now. They'll come around. They just need time to see what I see. I nodded, not convinced but exhausted from the argument. I agreed to let it go, not because I thought he was right, but because I was too tired to fight. It was easier to focus on my business, pouring my energy into something positive, something that was mine. Despite the personal turmoil, my business kept growing. Orders poured in, and my brand gained a following. I was doing interviews, photo shoots, and even talking about partnerships. My days were packed, and I thrived on the hustle. The evening of the charity dinner arrived, and it was held at a swanky hotel downtown. The event was all about supporting sports programs for kids and teenagers. As the main costume designer, I had decided on a blue and white theme that matched not just the decor, but some of the latest pieces from my sportswear line. Jack and I walked into the grand hall, a room buzzing with well-dressed guests and shimmering lights. I was nervous but excited to see my design showcased in such a grand setting. That excitement quickly soured when we spotted his parents across the room. Their cold stares cut right through the warmth of the bustling crowd. Jack noticed but said nothing, and their blatant disregard stung me deeply. But I bit my lip and kept walking. As guests began to arrive, I circulated the room, chatting and networking. Jack was by my side, his usual charming self, but I could tell he was a bit overwhelmed by the scale of the event. "You're really pulling out all the stops, huh?" Jack commented as we watched the crowd from a distance. "Go big or go home," I replied with a wink. "Elisa, you've outdone yourself," a familiar voice said from behind me. Turning around, I saw a local sports celebrity who'd worn my designs before. "These uniforms are fantastic." "Thanks so much." "Enjoy the evening," I smiled, handing them a business card. "Let's catch up soon." The event was buzzing, the atmosphere electric with enthusiasm and goodwill. Then the moment of truth arrived. The host took to the stage to thank the sponsors, and my heart raced as he started to speak. We hadn't been seated long when the evening's presenter took the stage to kick off the event. The atmosphere was lively, filled with applause and cheer, until it came time to thank the sponsors. My heart raced with pride and anxiety as my name was announced as one of the main contributors. I'd like to extend a special thank you to Elisa, whose generous donation of over $300,000 made tonight possible. The presenter boomed through the microphone. The room erupted in applause, but it was abruptly pierced by a shriek from Mrs. Thompson, Jack's mother. "Absolutely not," she screamed, drawing the room into a shocked silence. She demanded a microphone, and once it was handed to her, she didn't hesitate. "This is preposterous. Elisa couldn't possibly afford this. She's nothing but a poor beggar using my son's money. She's a cunning predator sneaking into our family to bankrupt us." Her words echoed through the hall, venomous and loud. The presenter, taken aback, composed himself quickly, but the damage was done. "Mrs. Thompson, I assure you, you are mistaken. Elisa's company is extremely successful and fully capable of such generosity. I know this firsthand." The crowd murmured, the tension palpable. Then, in an unexpected move, the presenter passed the microphone to Jack, hoping for him to clear the air. Jack's face was a mix of embarrassment and conflict. He glanced at his parents, then at me. His voice was barely a whisper as he spoke into the mic. "I have nothing to say," he muttered, and with that, he walked over to his parents, leaving me standing alone amidst a sea of whispers. The weight of the moment settled heavy on my shoulders. I felt exposed and humiliated, not just by the accusations, but by Jack's refusal to defend me, to affirm the truth about my success. The pride I had felt in my contribution was tarnished, overshadowed by the drama unfolding around me. Stepping into the spotlight, I approached the microphone, my heart pounding, but my resolve clear. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight." I started, my voice steady despite the tumble of emotions. "Tonight, I'd like to share something very personal about my journey." The room fell silent, all attention on me. I started as a street entrepreneur, not just to make ends meet, but driven by a dream. That dream led to the creation of a sportswear brand that many of you know now. Pausing, I looked around, meeting the eyes of young athletes and seasoned businessmen alike. When my company's profits hit $500,000, I fulfilled a promise to a very special person, my grandfather. I continued, my voice growing stronger. He left a will stating that his inheritance would go to a relative who made their own success, reaching that exact figure in their business. Whispers filled the hall, and I took a moment to let that sink in. That inheritance has been used to fuel not just my personal growth, but to give back through charity, much like tonight's event. The crowd was listening, some nodding as I unfolded more of my story. After the pandemic, my business didn't just survive, it thrived, growing several times over. Every challenge faced was a stepping stone. As I concluded, I said, I stand before you not just as a business owner, but as someone who believes in the power of perseverance and dedication. The room erupted into applause, some guests standing in ovation. I scanned the crowd, seeing faces light up with respect and admiration. But my eyes briefly caught Jack's parents. Their expressions, once haughty, now showed disbelief and embarrassment. They quietly exited the hotel. Jack, looking equally shaken, tried to approach me, muttering an apology. "Elisa, I just shook my head and walked past him, my emotions a mix of triumph and heartache. I needed space, not just from the evening's drama, but from everything. I decided to stay at the hotel that night, alone with my thoughts. Later, as I sat in the quiet of my hotel room, my phone rang. It was Mom. Her voice was thick with emotion. "I saw it all, honey. I simply want you to know how proud I am of you for taking the stage and reclaiming your truth and sharing your story. You are all that I wished you were." I went back home after spending the night at the motel to get my thoughts straight. It seemed different, heavier in some way, as though the strain from the previous several months was still inside the walls. Jack was waiting there. He made another attempt at apology as soon as he spotted me. I really apologize for everything, Elizabeth. His voice was anguished as he begged, "Can we just forget all this and start over?" I gave a headshake. Though it was obvious to me, the decision was difficult for me emotionally. I can't, Jack. Someone who can't defend me or who chooses his parents above his wife is not someone I want to be with. This has been developing for a while. It's not just about last night. He stretched out as his face dropped, but I took a step back. "I'm filing for divorce," I stated firmly. I didn't wait to hear back from him. After gathering a few necessities, I headed to my mother's house, which I had recently purchased with the money I received from my grandpa. After a storm, it seemed like a haven. Because of the prenuptial agreement we had signed, the divorce process was simple and ended swiftly because there were no children to take into account. Jack's parents attempted to step in during that period. They kept calling, attempting to make amends, not for me, but because their son's way of life had altered while I was gone. I banned their phone numbers. It was to cut off a history that was preventing me from moving forward, not only to stop the incessant ringing. According to acquaintances, Jack began drinking, lost his job, and finally his parents abandoned him because they didn't want his downward spiral to damage their image. I had a twinge of sympathy for him. I knew I had to go on, but I never wished him bad, despite everything. I had to focus on what could have been rather than what had really happened. I found the tranquility I needed to consider my options while living at my mother's house. I put more of myself into the business, which was still doing well, not just to divert attention from the divorce, but also to strengthen the foundations for my future. My mom turned to me with a kind grin on her face one evening as we were sitting in the garden we had created together. "Elisa, you made the correct decision. It's difficult, but you're more resilient, and I'm always here." "I'm grateful, Mom. I am aware." Feeling the weight of her support, I said, "It's just a lot to process." "As long as you keep in mind that you're creating, learning, and developing rather than just getting by." She squeezed my hand and murmured, "That's what matters." She was correct. My marriage ended, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter in my life, one in which I could make choices without worrying about whether I had support from others. One that would allow me to stand alone, not just as a prosperous businesswoman, but also as a person who has been changed by her experiences.